Hi guys, it's Mark Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also Mark Zicree of Space Command. And this is a video I've been wanting to do for a very long time. And finally I have the time to do it and the inclination. It's been a very busy time in terms of our various projects. We're shooting Voiceless Roar, Elaine's feature. We're shooting Great Solar War, the new Space Command episode. We are in post-production on Space Command Forgiveness, post-production on Space Command United Planet. Tons of stuff coming very, 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 very soon. And we have a Kickstarter campaign going on. It's listed down there, the link. Please go to it. Right now, it started well, but it's kind of faltering, which they tend to do in Kickstarter campaigns. Please go. Please throw some money our way. You can come on the set. You can wear a spacesuit. You can do any number of wonderful things. Tons of great perks, all sorts of stuff. And you'll want to be part of this. I promise you. It's going to be just spectacular. And but this video that I've been wanting to do is, some of you may have seen in various videos I've posted, my wall. This great living room wall of mine that has so many framed pictures. Now today what I'm going to do is take you on a tour of each picture. Now what's cool is that it forms something of a history of science fiction and also a history of my life. And there are many, many personal stories that you've never heard anywhere else that relate to many of your favorite TV shows and movies and personalities, and we are going to get into all of that right now. So get a cup of coffee, get a cup of tea, get your favorite Dr. Pepper or whatever interesting beverage you imbibe, and we are going to talk about all of these very, very, very cool items. We're going to be starting on this wall, and because it is daytime, we're going to get a bit of reflection off of the glass, but we'll try our best to show you these items in all their glory. This is a wonderful poster for Alien that was done in recent times. There was a book where they approached a number of artists to do their take on the wonderful Alien film, and I loved this poster, so I put it up because it says, "In space, no one can hear you scream," and it's just very lurid and very fun. And you know, it's Alien and Aliens are two of my favorite movies, as is Blade Runner, and we'll get into a lot of that stuff as we continue to talk. But this is the first item here on my wall. Now we go up, and you see that is a Rhamphorhynchus made out of metal. A Rhamphorhynchus is a pterodactyl, and it had sort of these saw teeth. And the pteranodons, pterodactyls, all of that species, people often think they're dinosaurs. They're not. They're flying lizards, flying reptiles, and they sort of filled the ecological niche 65, 100 million years ago that seagulls and pelicans do now. But I thought it was such a great representation, and it's just super cool. So Elaine and I got that in a shop and have had it on the wall ever since. Now if you go over here, you can see this very, very, very cool poster for 2001: A Space Odyssey. And this is, I believe, a German poster that came out in '68 when the movie came out. And it shows one of the stewardesses, and they are wearing their zero-G hats. And these hats were very difficult to make, very difficult to keep clean. So they would have to be very, very, very careful how they handled them. And but I've always loved that design. I always thought it was terrific, and I wanted to put it up on the wall. And every time I look at it, I smile. Now moving down, we see this. This is the cover page of the script to The Martian, and Ridley Scott actually, before he shot the movie, he drew this spacesuit, and he wrote the thought balloon, "I'm going to science the shit out of this planet," which is basically a paraphrase of a line in the book and in the movie. And this cover page actually went up into space to the ISS and then came back to Ridley Scott, and I thought it was a wonderful drawing. I mean, he's a wonderful artist on his own right. A style very similar to Mobius, the great French artist, and who highly inspired Ridley Scott, and who Ridley Scott worked with on Alien and many other films. So there's that. Then moving down, this is the spacesuit corner, and so this is. I met this wonderful astronaut. He was a shuttle astronaut, and he signed me a photo of himself, and I thought it was cool, and so I put that where it belongs. Then moving down, these are both spacesuits that are real and fanciful. Now, one of my favorite science fiction stories, as you know, is Journey into Space, which was written and produced and directed by Charles Chilton for the BBC. You can find it on Mr. Sci-Fi. Just do a search, and I have all of the episodes of Journey into Space that Mr. Chilton wrote. They aired in the 1950s. They're wonderful. One is a trip to the moon, one is a trip to Mars, and they did publicity photos. This is the cast, the radio cast, putting Charles Chilton's hero, Jet Morgan, into his spacesuit, and even though it's a radio show, and they had borrowed a prototype spacesuit from the aerospace industry. And if you see photos sometimes that you have all of them posed in spacesuits, and they only had one. So they basically, that was a photo montage that they put together from one spacesuit being worn by 4 guys. Now we come down, and this, if you notice, this is a signed photo of the Mercury astronaut, Scott Carpenter. Now, when I was a kid, I grew up during the space age, during the 60s. The race was on between the Russians and the Americans. And when I was in daycare after school, they would have these launches. They would have the news coverage of these launches live, and our daycare teachers and our school teachers would bring out these big wooden black and white TV sets, and we would watch. All of us would sit on the floor and watch the launch and watch the coverage, the news coverage, and it was just magical. I think we had little pads or something, so you know, we weren't being maltreated. But this was one of my heroes when I was a little kid, Scott Carpenter. We're talking the early 60s, and so I grew up during a time when science fiction and science fact really were running parallel. And then now we go down to this cool drawing, and one of our Space Command fans drew this for me, wishing me well, and I thought it was really, really fun, and so I framed it. So very cool. Thanks so much. We really love everyone helping us and everyone standing for us. Now this over here is John Glenn, of course, was the first American to orbit the Earth, and I saw that when I was a kid, and they had a commemoration of that when he went back into space as an old guy. And this is a first day of issue envelope with a photo of the space shuttle astronaut Barbara Morgan, and she signed this. This is actually signed by her, and so again, another wonderful piece of memorabilia from the astronauts. Then just below that, of course, is one of the great spacesuits of all time. This is a photo of the spacesuit from 2001, A Space Odyssey, with a signature under it of Keir Delay, whom I've met several times. And this is one of my 2 favorite spacesuits, the other one being Alien. And now I have a helmet that my friend Greg Jean made that's a replica of the 2001 spacesuit helmet he owned, and I also have a replica spacesuit that from 2001, and I'm currently talking with Adam Savage's team about restoring it, and Adam Savage is going to be helping me on that. So now we go below, and you can see this is me at age 15 in the apartment I grew up in, and I'm wearing the spacesuit that I wear in Space Command Redemption. This is a real Navy high-altitude suit from the 50s. It was bought by my mother from Western Costume when they had a rare sale to the public. Western Costume, of course, outfits movies and TV shows, and my mom bought it for me for $25, and it is a working spacesuit. If Earth lost its atmosphere, I could last for a little while in that thing, and it's wonderful. I'm so glad I got to put it in Space Command, and you know, it's and that shows what a terrific mom I had. The fact that she would buy, I think she bought it for me when I was 12, and then I've had it ever since, and that's me at 15. So you can see I was a handsome young man, and very proud to be in my spacesuit. I actually did some student films wearing that spacesuit, which someday hopefully I can share with you guys. Now below that, of course, is me in that spacesuit in Space Command, same spacesuit, and I signed it to myself to mark my #1 fan, Mark Zickery. So I thought it was only fair, only fair. And then immediately above that photo of me from Space Command is a great candid photo from Alien, with the 2 actors lounging, including the wonderful Veronica Cartwright, lounging in their wonderful Mobius-designed spacesuits in a great candid moment on Alien. So now, continuing our spacesuit theme, There was a wonderful science fiction artist named Kelly Freas, who I also got to meet. Though it's very funny because I hired him at a convention to do a portrait of me, and the portrait ended up looking more like him than like me, which is why I don't have it on this wall. But he does wonderful portraits of the Star Trek actors, and this is his great portrait of Spock wearing the Tholian Webb spacesuit. This is a spacesuit designed by the great William Ware Tice, and when we did the Star Trek episode, Star Trek New Voyages episode, World Enough in Time, we replicated that spacesuit, so now I have that spacesuit at my studio. But I loved this painting by Kelly Freas, and here it is. Now we move into sort of the Star Trek area of my wall. This is a wonderful painting of, well, let me get back a little so you can see it, a wonderful painting of Khan Noonien Singh, played by the great Ricardo Montalban. Yes, that really was his chest. And I saw this at the Star Trek Las Vegas convention last year, and I just loved it, and it now adorns my wall. And then finishing out the spacesuit part of the wall, this is Brad Pitt, signed by Brad Pitt from the movie Ad Astra, where he played an astronaut. It's not one of my favorite movies, but I thought it had some good things in it, and probably the only movie I've ever seen that had space baboons, of all things, murderous space baboons. But I really liked that photo, and Brad Pitt, he is an amazing actor, no two ways about it. Then moving back up here, you can see up there is the Kelly Freas illustration of Uhura that Nichelle Nichols signed to me, and it's a lovely, lovely representation of her. And she had the original of that on her wall at her house, so I got to take a photo of it when we shot her scene for Space Command. But I've known her, of course, since I was 10 years old, and was introduced to her, and then went on the Star Trek set, and then we filmed her 50 years later, before her passing, in a wonderful scene for Space Command, and it was a dream come true. And this is a lovely portrait of her by Kelly Freas, and certain of the portraits he did don't quite capture the actors as well. I've never really liked his portrait of Kirk, but certainly with Uhura and certainly with Spock, he captured the best of what these wonderful performers had to offer. Now moving down, we get to Spock's ears from Star Trek the Motion Picture. Steve Neill, who did those ears and applied them back for Star Trek the Motion Picture in 1979, made me a copy of them. And so there they are, and again, a very proud possession, because they are certainly iconic and wonderful, and Spock is a unique creation, and Leonard Nimoy is the actor who portrayed him best, obviously, much as I like some of the other actors, but he is Spock. And then we go down to a photo signed by Leonard Nimoy, and that photo, of course, is from the first Star Trek episode, The Cage, in which he starred with Jeffrey Hunter. And that, of course, leads to a wonderful quiz question. If you're ever in a bar and want to win a bar bet, say, which actor was in the most episodes of Star Trek, which lead actor, and that's Leonard Nimoy, because he's in one more episode than William Shatner, who was in the second pilot. Now we go down to another prized possession. This is a phaser from the original show. This is a phaser that was actually used on Star Trek, screen used, 1966-69. Someone offered this to me many years ago, and I took it to my friend Greg Jean, who was an expert on all things Star Trek and was one of the great model builders of all time. Professionally, he built the mothership in Close Encounters, built the city in Blade Runner, which he gave me a piece of. I've got in the other room, and so he verified that this was authentic, and I bought it. So it's probably my favorite ray gun design of all time, and you can see it's cracked along the bottom, but you can see how roughly made it is. Because this was not what's called a hero prop. This was not for close-ups. This was just like worn on their pants. On the other side, there's a little piece of Velcro, and they would just wear it on their pants, and and so it didn't need to be super, super detailed. So the prop men made it work for what it needed to do. Now we go down here. Now another one of my favorite movies is The Time Machine, George Pal, 1960, Rod Taylor, and my friend Bob Burns, who was a phenomenal collector, and he also played a professional gorilla. He was Tracy in the Ghostbusters show that has nothing to do with Ghostbusters, but was, Larry Storch and Forrest Tucker, and Bob Burns played the gorilla, Tracy. But Bob was also one of the amazing collectors. His collection was phenomenal, and among the things he owned was the Time Machine. And so this is me sitting in the Time Machine. It's one of the most gorgeous props ever built by anyone. And the wheel turns and the lights light up, and it doesn't go through time, sadly, but when Bob got it. It was auctioned off at the MGM auction in the 70s, but Bob didn't get it there. It ended up somewhere like a carnival, and they stripped it down. It didn't have the chair. So when Bob got it, it was in very sorry condition, and together with his friends, including Mike Miner, who was a Star Trek artist, and Dorothy Fontana, DC Fontana, who was a writer and story editor for Star Trek, they restored it to its glory. And I'm sure that eventually this will come up for auction, as all things eventually do, and I'm sure it will go for mucho bucks. I will not be owning this time machine, but it was such a thrill to sit in it. I loved that. And Bob Burns was one of the great guys of all time, still with us, thank God. But you know, it's such an honor to know these people. So now we continue up to this. Now we're moving out of sort of that realm into some of the other people I've known and loved. This is Studs Terkel talking to myself. Studs Terkel was a TV and radio personality who was probably the best interviewer I've ever met. He would interview people like Arthur Miller or Truman Capote or whomever, and really ask questions that would get to the deepest part of them, that would really reveal who they were, what they felt, what they thought. He had an amazing knack for that. And when the World Science Fiction Convention was in Chicago, I knew that two of my friends knew him, Harlan Ellison and the great Norman Corwin. And we'll talk about Corwin in a minute, but I was able to use their names with him. I asked if I could use them to introduce myself. And so I did, and I got to meet Studs and share a drink with him. And then he was doing a screening of one of his favorite films, so he invited me to that, and signed various books and other things. And so this one he signed to Elaine. It says, "To Elaine, here's to you and Mark, and that better world we all work and hope for. Peace, grace, and beauty, Studs Terkel." Now, he's no longer with us, but by God, if you've never read his books, please seek them out. He did a lot of oral histories, and they're wonderful books. One of them is The Good War, and phenomenal. So this, of course, is a signed letter from Gene Roddenberry. Now, Gene, I loved the stationery from the original Star Trek. This is the office stationery with the Enterprise, and when I was a kid I got copies of that stationery because you could buy them from Roddenberry's company, Lincoln Enterprises, when Star Trek was on NBC, when it was airing originally. So I found this letter signed by Roddenberry, and it's a very funny letter because someone wrote them asking what the uniforms were made of and could they take photos off the screen. And it basically says, I'll sum up what it says essentially. It says, well, the costumes are made of velour, which we have to dry clean, and no, you cannot take photos off the screen. That's a violation of copyright. But here's a catalog from Lincoln Enterprises, and you can buy various items that we sell. So, so sincerely, Gene Roddenberry. So, it's great. It's perfect. So, but, and you know, originally when Roddenberry conceived of Star Trek, his idea was he specifically designed the tricorders and the communicators and the phasers so they could be toys, that they would be and when Star Trek debuted, it was not hugely successful right off the bat, and so it was many years before you get screen accurate versions of those as toys. The first Star Trek toys were not nearly as good as they would later become, and they're still making copies of tricorders and phasers and communicators, and they do a lot more now than they did back then. And so that was but a very proud thing to have. And now down here, another really cool thing. Now these two guys are Frankie Thomas on the right and Ed Kemmer on the left. They were the stars of the two great science fiction shows of the early 1950s. Space Patrol was Ed Kemmer playing Buzz Corey, and Frankie Thomas played Tom Corbett, Space Cadet. And years later, they got back in their old costumes and took a photo shaking each other's hands. So this is probably 20 or 30 years after the shows went off the air. They ran from 1950 to 55. They both were very, very successful and spawned a lot of toys and books and comic books and all sorts of stuff. And I met both of them, and I got them both to sign their catchphrases: "Smoking Rockets," Ed Kemmer, parentheses Buzz Corey, and "For Mark, Spaceman's Luck," Frankie Thomas, aka alias Tom Corbett. So really, really wonderful. And again, these shows are on YouTube now, so you can see them. And I own one of the cast-worn tunics from Space Patrol, and I also own one of the cast-worn uniforms from Tom Corbett, worn by one of the female members of the cast. And these are very, very, very prized items. Now we move up to the next row, and we see this astonishingly beautiful photograph. Now, who the hell is that? This is a writer named Anita Luce, And this is a terrific photo, and it was taken in the 1920s, if you can believe that. Now, she was a writer, and she wrote a book called Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which was made into a very successful play and then a very successful movie starring Marilyn Monroe. But the book is hugely entertaining, wonderfully funny, a very comedic book, because she was seeing that her male friends would like fall all over themselves for dumb blondes, and they, whereas they expect her to carry her own luggage. And so she wrote a satirical book commenting on that whole notion, and it still holds up. It's really entertaining. And then I found this playbill from a performance of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and it was done on stage with the wonderful Carol. I'm drawing a blank on her name, but it'll come back to me. But she was terrific in it. Her name may even be there on the document. Where is it? Anyway, be that as it may. But that was signed by Anita Luce, and at the Ziegfeld Theater, New York. And I thought, that's a keeper. That's definitely a keeper. So, and as you'll notice, many of these things on my wall I put into various themes, and so that really kind of helps bring unity to this wall. Now we continue down, and there's a 3D photo of me with Carlton E. Morse. Now, Carlton E. Morse, many of the people on my wall here are writers, some are artists, but these are people who were friends. Now, Carlton Morse, he was one of the most prolific writers of old radio. Now, there are two art forms that vanished in the 20th century, and one was silent movies, and the other was radio drama and comedy. Because before television, that was the mass medium. Beyond everything else, people tuned in, millions of people, hundreds of millions of people tuned in to listen to the radio. Now, interestingly enough, when TV came in, radio drama and comedy kept going in Britain, but it died out here. And then there were various fitful attempts to revive it. Now, finally, we actually have podcasts where people are doing radio drama and radio comedy. And but Carlton Morse was the great writer of the 30s through the 1950s. And he created a show called One Man's Family that was essentially, they call it a soap opera, but it really isn't. It's a family drama. And it's about a family, and he would basically often base it on the actors' lives themselves. So, for instance, during World War II, when one of the actors, young actors, went off to war, they would have that character, the family would get letters from that character, and they would actually be the letters that the real actor was writing to his own family. And so people were able to follow these characters for decades and feel that they were very much a part of their own lives. And it was a very talented cast, made up of Barton Yarborough and many other, Michael Raffetto, many other great performers. But after doing, and it was 5 days a week, I think 15 minutes a day, and Carlton Morse was writing all of them essentially, and he kind of got tired of writing family drama. And it wasn't that he didn't want to do it, but he wanted something to kind of cleanse his palate and do something wildly different. So he started writing this adventure series called I Love a Mystery, and it's one of my absolute favorites of all time. And so it's Jack, Doc, and Reggie having adventures all over the world, and the A1 Detective Agency is their agency. And he recorded it with Michael Raffetto and Barton Yarborough as Jack Packard and Doc Long in the 30s. And then in the 40s, he took the scripts and repeated them with a different cast, and that included Tony Randall as the British guy Reggie York. And it's funny because he auditioned initially for Doc Long and couldn't get the Texan accent right. And he said, I just can't get it. And they said, that's it. And he said, what, for Doc Long? He said, no, for Reggie, the English guy. So it's a little bit of a shaky accent, but Tony Randall was a wonderful actor. He starred on TV as one of the Odd Couple, Felix in The Odd Couple, and he also is in one of my favorite George Pal movies, The Seven Faces of Dr. Lao, in which he plays 7 characters, and if you've never seen that film, I recommend it. It could never be made today in the way it was back then, but it won William Tuttle his first Oscar. But back to Carlton Morse. So I belong to an organization called SPERDVAC, the Society to Preserve and Encourage Radio Drama, Variety and Comedy, and they would have monthly meetings, and this is maybe 30 years ago. And so they would have people who were actors and writers and directors of these great classic radio shows from the 30s, 40s, 50s come and talk. And Carlton Morse was one of their honored guests. And I actually wrote an article in the SPERDVAC Bulletin about I Love a Mystery and how wonderful it was and how it really held up over time. And it was one of my favorite things ever. And Carlton Morse loved it. And And so I arranged to drive up to Northern California and visit him at his home, and that was a sign on his wall of the A1 Detective Agency, and it was on his wall. It had been used, I guess, for publicity for the radio show, and he let me take it off the wall and get a photo of him and myself. Now, interestingly enough, one of our Space Command investors is the stepson of Carlton Morris. Carlton Morris passed on years ago, but his stepson is a wonderful, wonderful Space Command devotee, and he gave me these two watches. And this is the stopwatch where Carlton Morris, when he was directing I Love a Mystery, he would time it to make sure, because these were broadcast live and recorded, and so they had to come into they had to land on a specific time. They couldn't run over, not like today, and that's his watch and his pocket watch, and these are the ones he used to make those shows, to make sure that those shows ran on time, and so these are prized treasures from my collection. So now we continue down, and we reach the great Norman Corwin. Now it's a little hard to see his signature because it's sort of covered by the frame. It says to Mark, Norman, and what this is. Norman Corwin was the mentor of Ray Bradbury, and he was who Rod Serling wanted to grow up to be. He was a writer on radio principally. He did write the script for Lust for Life, the Van Gogh movie starring Kirk Douglas's Van Gogh. He was nominated for an Oscar for that, but his prime medium really was radio. He was a great radio dramatist and poet, and he was approached by CBS to write. When World War II was coming to an end in Europe, they wanted to air something that would tell people what that victory meant, who we were, where we'd come from, and where we were going. And he wrote this amazing hour-long show called On a Note of Triumph, and it was spectacular, and it aired on all of the radio networks simultaneously with no commercials. And it was so popular because this is back when most people did not have recorders of any kind, and so it was so popular they actually first of all they repeated the broadcast, but then they issued it on an LP album, 78s, and this is it. And I thought it's a wonderful cover with a GI, and if you ever want to listen to it, it is on YouTube. You can listen to it on YouTube and various other places, but I highly recommend it. It is one of the greatest pieces of writing ever done by anyone. And the way I knew about Norman was as with Carlton Morris, I was a devotee of radio. So from when I was a teenager, I knew about Norman Corwin. And then when I was in my first drawing class at UCLA, when I was a painting, sculpture, and graphic arts major, one of the girls in the class was Diane Corwin. And I said, well, are you related to Norman Corwin? And she was flabbergasted that I knew who her dad was, who Norman was, because the younger generation didn't tend to. And so soon after that, I met Norman, and he was this incredibly gracious guy, this wonderful intellect, this wonderfully funny and charming man. And he actually lived to be, I think, 101 years old, 102. And we were friends for about 40 years until he died. But he had been a mentor to Ray Bradbury, and he's the one who invited Ray Bradbury to come to New York, introduced him to all the publishers, and was directly responsible for the Martian Chronicles and the Illustrated Man Selling, which were the two big sales that really got Ray's career going. And so I knew both Ray, of course, and Corwin, and their like will not be seen again. They were remarkable men and brilliant men. I mean, Norman knew everyone who was anyone back then. You had not arrived as an actor until you had been in a Norman Corwin radio production. So he knew everybody. He knew he was pals with Orson Welles and all of the major actors in Hollywood, and he also knew people in the political sphere. So I could say to him, well, what was Eleanor Roosevelt like? And he'd tell me, because he'd known her, and so forth. So just a phenomenal man. So definitely check out his work. You will be well rewarded. So now we go up to the next row over, and this is more writers. Now this is the great George Clayton Johnson, and he signed that to me some years ago. He's no longer with us, sadly, but this is George Clayton Johnson. He was the great writer of The Twilight Zone. So he wrote Kick the Can, he wrote Nothing in the Dark, he wrote A Game of Pool, he then wrote the first episode of Star Trek that ever aired, which was the Man Trap, about the salt vampire, and then he co-wrote the novel Logan's Run with William F. Nolan. And so I first met him when I was a teenager at a science fiction convention, and he encouraged me to write The Twilight Zone companion. He introduced me to people. He was the first person I interviewed for the Twilight Zone Companion. In fact, the first book I wrote, 3 Interviews on Media and Society, he was one of those 3 interviews, and I wrote that book when I was in college, and you can actually buy it now. It's available for purchase. I think it's on Amazon. I'll find out. But George was very, he had great cheekbones. He was part Native American, and an amazing intellect, an amazing imagination, a great writer. He was part of Charles Beaumont's circle. Charles Beaumont was one of the great writers of Twilight Zone, a protege of Ray Bradbury, and a pal of Richard Matheson, and William F. Nolan, Dennis Etchison, many other writers. And so they were all palling around and inspiring each other back then. And George, now soon after I took this photo, this is around 1975 when I took this photo, and George, that was, Logan's Run had just come out, and or was about to come out, and so MGM had a wall-size poster of Logan's Run on their outside wall in Culver City, and George and I went there, and I posed him next to his credit on that wall, because those letters were probably about 2 feet tall each letter. And so I got photos of him standing by that, and then this is the closer shot. And not long after, George grew a long beard, and my photo of him with a beard has appeared on a number of books of his. But this was, this was from a transitional stage, because previously he'd had short hair, and then he grew his hair out long. He's probably about 50 in this photo, but a very handsome man, and just a character, one of a kind. And I was so lucky to know him, and he's just, I mean, had he only written Kick the Can, just that one script, that would have made his reputation forever. And through him I learned that you can write one script and you can change the world, and you can reach millions of people, and you can be remembered forever. He used to talk to me about when he told people he wrote for Twilight Zone, people's eyes would widen and they'd be like, well, how could you have written those? Don't those come from the dawn of time? But if you want to read more about George, it's in Twilight Zone Companion, and I'm so honored to have known him. Now, another of my writers and mentors, my friends and mentors, was the great Theodore Sturgeon. And again, this is a photo I took of Ted, and he signed it to me. I took his writing class when I was 19 at UCLA Extension. As a UCLA undergrad, I wasn't supposed to take his class because it was for adult education, but I wasn't going to miss an opportunity to take a class taught by the great Theodore Sturgeon. He was one of the great science fiction writers. He wrote for Star Trek, he wrote Amok Time and Shore Leave, but more than that, he wrote brilliant short stories, brilliant novels, just unique. And if you've never read his work, definitely go check it out. He wrote a great story called The Saucer of Loneliness. This is one of my absolute favorites of all time. And this is a photo I took. I was 19 years old when I took this photo with my Nikon, and that photo was used on a number of his books as his author's photo. So, and he was a dear friend. Both he and George attended my my wedding to Elaine. And to know these men, these brilliant writers, they were both so encouraging to me in the young years. And through Ted, his teaching assistant in that class was Michael Reeves. And Michael and I became dear friends and co-wrote Smurfs and He-Man, and I wrote those on my own as well. And we co-wrote World Enough in Time, which I've just reposted on Mr. Sci-Fi, the great Sulu episode that Michael and I wrote, and were nominated for the Hugo and the Nebula for having written. So, but Ted, if not for taking Ted's class, if not for breaking the rules, I wouldn't have gotten to know either Michael or Ted, and they were both huge influences on my life. So now we move over a little here. Now, who's this guy? What's this thing? Now, John Wyndham was another great science fiction writer. I did not know him. He was British, and he died in the 70s. But he was the author of, well, he actually has a very interesting career. This is the inside of a jam jar, the lid of a jam jar, and he's and the artist does all these portraits of authors and other famous people. And I saw this on eBay. This is an original, and I thought, well, that's really cool, And Wyndham is posing with the characters from a book he wrote called The Midwich Cuckoos that was made into a really creepy movie called Village of the Damned. And the thing about Wyndham that's so really interesting, really fascinating, and was, science fiction back in the 50s and 60s was a small community. Everyone knew everyone else. It was maybe a few thousand people at most. And Wyndham had started writing in the 30s, but he was trying to imitate the American writers. He was trying to not really write from his own experience, just to imitate others. And he had a middling successful career in the 30s under the name John Bainan, or John Bainan Harris. And he had a number of different names, like he was John Bainan Harris, Wyndham, blah, 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 whatever. You know, it's like any mixture. Lucas Parks, you know, like 18 names that ended with Wyndham because he was British. And then he was in World War II, and he was working in World War II, I think as a cryptographer or something. And when he came out of the war, he decided he was going to try something different. And so what he did was he decided to write things based on his experience living in England. And he started writing these wonderful novels set in England and similar environments about average, ordinary people having extraordinary things happening to them. So he wrote the Day of the Triffids, which is about these plants that, you know, there's an event that causes everyone to go blind, with very few exceptions, and then these walking plants start preying on them. It was a huge hit both here and in England. I have the first editions of both, and it was made into a movie and many TV series since. And that got him going. And so then after that, he wrote The Midwich Cuckoos, which was about the people in a small town in England all fall unconscious, and when they wake up, all the women are pregnant, but they're pregnant with what an alien has impregnated them with, which are these really weird, creepy kids who are very smart and linked telepathically. And it was again made into a very good movie, Village of the Damned, and but the novel's terrific as well, and it's also been remade a number of times too. And then Wyndham wrote other novels that I very much like. The Kraken Wakes is one of my favorite novels, sort of like a seagoing version of War of the Worlds. And then he wrote a great book called Chalky that's been made into a wonderful BBC radio play. All of these have been made into really wonderful BBC radio plays that you can listen to on YouTube, thanks to YouTube. But anyway, this is a jelly jar lid, and quite a nice one. So now continuing on, over here, this is the great Kurt Vonnegut. And I never met him in person, but he's one of my favorite writers. I love his work. Mother Night is a book I love. Slaughterhouse-Five, of course. Sirens of Titan, Breakfast of Champions. It's funny because much of his output, Timequake, much of his output was science fiction, but he's not regarded as a science fiction writer, and that was very deliberately. He wanted to be viewed as a mainstream writer and worked very hard to achieve that, and he did achieve it, even though science fiction motifs are in many, many, many of his novels. Space travel, and time travel figure again and again and again. Slaughterhouse-Five is this great book, of course, in which he lived through the firebombing of Dresden, lived to tell the tale. And that's Vonnegut. That photo was taken by his wife, Jill Cremens, who was a photographer. A really lovely, lovely photo. And when my mom passed away, I wrote a letter to Vonnegut and included the eulogy I wrote for her. And he wrote me this letter, and it says, "Dear Mark Scott Zicree, that's lovely that your mother died painlessly and with good news about you to carry into the next world with her. I'm glad, too, that she put on your cap and gown and was congratulated by a stranger on joining the exclusive company of the highly educated. I have heard enough stories like hers now to conclude that those who are wrecked by horrible childhoods are the exceptions. Most people are kind and delightful no matter what. Amazing. My first wife, Jane, with whom I remained friendly after our separation a quarter of a century ago, also died on an uptick last December. She was 1 year older than your mother, and what your mother surely would have liked to be, a Phi Beta Kappa English major from Swarthmore. She had always wanted to be a writer and must have been flummoxed by my success. So she never wrote anything until the very end while she was dying of cancer. Damned if she didn't finish a book, a sort of autobiography. Among the very last things she heard on earth was that it was bought by Houghton Mifflin, was an alternate selection by the Literary Guild, and had been optioned for a TV miniseries. Ha! Hot dog. Cheers, Kurt Vonnegut." So this again is, a prized possession, and amazing content. Now, fascinatingly enough, and the reason that I have Theodore Sturgeon by Vonnegut on my wall, is because it turns out that when Vonnegut was working as a car salesman back east, he became friends with Ted Sturgeon, who was a struggling writer for the pulp magazines and for paperbacks and so forth, and where you might get paid $1,000 for a novel. And they became friends, and Vonnegut was an aspiring writer, but he hadn't cracked it yet, hadn't really broken in. So later, years later, he created a struggling writer character named Kilgore Trout that was based, sort of a satiric view of Theodore Sturgeon, hence the name. So Theodore Sturgeon, Kilgore Trout, get it? Theodore Kilgore, Sturgeon, another kind of fish, trout. So Theodore Sturgeon and Kilgore trout, and it was only after Ted's passing that Vonnegut admitted that Kilgore trout was inspired by Theodore Sturgeon. But I got to deal with both these guys, and that was super, super, super fun. So now we move down to Harlan Ellison, another phenomenal writer. If you've never read him, please do. Now this, Harlan I met when I was a teenager. He was a Roman candle of a person. He was so... Well, I always used to joke that Harlan burnt his bridges while he was on them. Harlan wrote the greatest episode of the original Star Trek ever, The City on the Edge of Forever. He was a great mentor to me. He introduced me to the Clarion Writers Workshop. He, we had a sort of very friendly, but also he could be very prickly, very difficult. But we knew each other. And the last thing he ever said to me was he and George Clayton Johnson were at a library event. To remember Ray Bradbury, and I spoke very movingly about Ray from my experiences. And as I was leaving, Harlan said, "It's good to see you, Mark." And that was very nice to have that be the last words Harlan ever said to me. So, but this is a drawing I did of Harlan when I was a teenager. I was maybe like 16, 17 years old when I drew this. And so I gave him the original of it, which I drew, and he signed the photograph I took, the Polaroid I took of the original, but I liked it so much I drew a second one for myself. So this is the one that but if you go to Harlan's website, this picture is on the landing page of his website, and I'm very proud of it. And what I should say about it is, I drew it in pen, and because Harlan's great book cover illustrators were Leo and Diane Dillon, a phenomenal married couple they did many book covers and books, children's books. You've seen their work a million times in a million places, but Harlan had them illustrate many of his covers. And so they had a very specific style, and so I kind of was imitating their style in all of these skulls and faces and eyes in his jacket. So that was my little tribute to them. And I drew that in 1974. So I would have been, I think, 17, something like that. And Harlan really liked that picture. And then next to that is Harlan and his wonderful wife, Susan. Now, and I love this photo because of the way he's holding her and the way she's holding him protectively. And she was a good deal younger than Harlan. Harlan died in his early 80s after a stroke, sadly. And sadly, after that, about a year or so later, Susan died at 60 in her sleep, which is really, really sad. She was a wonderful person. And the fascinating thing about their relationship was when I first knew Harlan, which was in his late 30s into his early 40s, and I knew him through his entire life, from that point on. Harlan, when I first knew him, was dating all these girls, and he was sort of misogynistic, and he campaigned a lot for the Equal Rights Amendment, which was for women's rights, but he would date a lot of women, and they were very disposable. And then he met Susan, and Susan would tap back to him. She didn't take any shit, and she was a wonderful spirit, and then he just fell for her hook, line, and sinker, and they were married, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, something like that, and she always looked the same and was just this warm, wonderful presence in his life and in ours, because whenever we'd see her or talk to her, she was just such a dear soul. And when I saw this photograph, I thought, well, I really, really, really want to get a copy of that. And so I hunted down the photographer, and he made me a copy. And it was just, it really represents who they were, and it's a great photo of their love. And I miss both of them, and I wish time had been kinder. But there you go. And Joe Straczynski is now the executor of Harlan's estate and is looking to turn Harlan's house, Ellison Wonderland, into sort of a study center and so forth. So now we go on to the next wonderful thing on a wall full of wonders. This is the first playbill of Death of a Salesman, and that's a photo of Arthur Miller. And when I was story editing Friday the 13th, the series, I wrote a story about my dad that it was an episode of that show, and it had this little end speech, this soliloquy, and I wrote to Arthur Miller, and I said, this is the soliloquy, and I was very highly inspired by Death of a Salesman, and would you sign this playbill for me? And he did. And so it says, for Mark Scott Zickery from Arthur Miller, all best. And, just a cool thing to have. I never met him in person, but I thought, that's a neat thing to have, absolutely. So now we go down here, and who is this? Now you all may be very surprised to learn who this is. That is Philip K. Dick, about the time that he wrote The Man in the High Castle. Look at how young and handsome he was, and what a sharp intellect he clearly has. This was a photo taken by Arthur Knight, who was a movie critic for Playboy magazine, and this is when he was writing like 12 novels a year, before the later sort of, paunchy Philip K. Dick that we got to know. He won the Hugo Award for Best Novel for Man in the High Castle, and rightly so. It was many years later made into a very, very good TV series. Philip K. Dick died fairly young in his 50s. And by then he was sort of the Philip K. Dick that people recognize from photos and videos. Sort of a paunchy guy with a beard and mustache, a gray beard and mustache. But this is the version of him that I really love to consider, because he is so sharp here and so cool looking. Now, this is a letter he wrote, and it was very short, but I really loved it. And let me get it on this side. Yeah. And he says here, "Dear Doris, this money is to help you get yourself a bed. I have the feeling that you have been somewhat badly treated on your birthday this year, and I would like to make up for that. So here is my present to you with my love, Phil." So I think that's just a very kind little letter, and Philip K. Dick's signatures and signed books and so forth are hard to come by, but I've always wanted one. And so at an antiquarian book show this past year, I treated myself to that wonderful, wonderful thing. And people often talk about how crazy Philip K. Dick was and all the drugs he took, the amphetamines and so forth. And he's written about that in The Scanner Darkly and many other books. But he wasn't this raving lunatic that some people might make him out to be. I was talking to the author of Timescape, and Gregory Benford, and he's very right-wing and totally the political opposite of Philip K. Dick, but he was a dear friend of Philip K. Dick's, and he said no. Even at the end, his intellect was sharp. He was a kind, great guy, very funny, a really good friend, and so that's nice to hear that about Philip K. Dick, because you want to hear good things about the writers whose work you love. So I thought you'd enjoy hearing about that. So now we continue down here, and this is a photo of Orson Welles. Now, the great Orson Welles, of course, starred in Citizen Kane, was a brilliant director. He directed Citizen Kane, and he was also the great radio actor who played The Shadow and did the War of the Worlds, and many, 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 many other things. Well, Jim Metropole, who was a friend of mine and a member of my round table, was also a photographer. He photographed a lot of rock and roll stars on assignment, and he also was hired to be a photographer on a commercial that Orson Welles was shooting, and he caught this amazing shot of Welles lighting a cigar in an alley, and it's just so moody and so evocative. And he made a print of it for me and gave it to me, and I just love it. I think it's wonderful. So now, continuing up, we get to some of the Victorian writers and personalities. Now, this guy in the middle, who looks kind of, like a staid Victorian gentleman, is a writer named H. Rider Haggard. That is his genuine signature. And H. Rider Haggard was a writer, and in the later part of the 19th century, I'm a big fan of a lot of the British writers from the 19th century, and also some of the Americans as well, Twain, Dickens, H. Rider Haggard, etc. And Haggard has a very interesting story, which is that he was reading Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, another great book, and he said to his brother, "I could write a book as good as that one or better." And so his brother challenged him to do so. And H. Rider Haggard had been spending many years in Africa, and so he wrote a terrific book called King Solomon's Mines, which I have a first edition of. It's a wonderful book if you've never read it. I mean, it's really clear he knows his stuff. He knows Africa. But then he wrote a book even better, which is a book called She by H. Rider Haggard, and I have the first edition of that, and is one of the greatest fantasy stories ever written. It's about several men who find a woman who is immortal, ruling over a group of people in Africa, and she is the most beautiful woman ever. And it is a phenomenal piece of work, and beautifully written, and amazing. And the character of She is both incredibly beguiling, but also really scary, because she wields her power with a great amount of ruthlessness. But the phrase "she who must be obeyed" comes from that book, that she is, that is what her tribesmen refer to her as, she who must be obeyed. And then later, Rumpole of the Bailey, which was a British series about a very cantankerous lawyer, he referred to his wife as she who must be obeyed. So it's a reference to that book by H. Rider Haggard. Now we come down further, and what we see here is a drawing of the great Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass, for those who don't know, was an escaped slave who became one of the great writers and thinkers and speakers of the 19th century. And this is an original drawing. And the fascinating thing about this is there was a point at which they were going to do a Frederick Douglass robot at Disney World. And this is a sketch for that project. And ultimately that robot never got made. But here is Frederick Douglass in all of his great handsomeness and intellect. And Elaine loved that drawing, as do I. And so I bought it for her as a present. Now, going down here, let's move some of the lighting so we can see what all this is. Let's get over here. I think this will, we're crossing the line. Okay, yeah, we'll find it, we'll get it. There we go. Yeah, good. Let's move this away a little bit so you can see what this is. Now, one of the greatest science fiction movies ever made, of course, is Metropolis. And this is the first edition British novel of Metropolis by Thea von Harbu. She was the wife of the director, Fritz Lang. And they wrote the novel and the film sort of simultaneously, more or less. I think the book came out first, and it shows an illustration of this great robot who is certainly the inspiration for C-3PO. And this is a postcard of the lead actress, Bridget Helm. This is a postcard from the 1920s when the movie came out, and one of her phenomenal outfits from Metropolis, and it is signed by her. So this is first edition of the novel and a signed photo of the lead actress. She played both the robot and Maria, who was sort of the saintly woman, but the robot then is made to look like her and lead the people below stairs astray. If you've never seen it, make sure you see the complete version, because they found an extra 40 minutes of the movie like 80 years afterwards, and it's an amazing thing. It's amazing to see the complete version because it is spectacular. And if you've never seen Metropolis, you've not seen one of the great science fiction films of all time. So definitely seek it out. You can find it online. You can find it on home video. It is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So now continuing down below that, here's a guy who writes with an extremely scraggly hand. And this is Eugene O'Neill, one of the great playwrights of all time. He wrote Long Day's Journey into Night, one of the greatest autobiographical plays ever written, and if you've never seen it, definitely go check it out. It's about his family, and it's harrowing. It's about his mother's heroin addiction or morphine addiction, and it was only performed after he died because he was basically writing so directly about his own family's tragedies that it couldn't be performed while he was alive. But when he was older, he had Parkinson's, and his handwriting became very shaky. And so this is a little note he wrote, and it's just, he was an amazing guy. I think he was fairly difficult temperament, but really an amazing fellow. Okay, so now this is the great H.G. Wells, the father of modern science fiction. H.G. Wells wrote a number of my favorite books, but most specifically The Time Machine. If you've never read that, it is a fabulous, fabulous book, and brilliant, and it really holds up. He also did The War of the Worlds, The Invisible Man, Island of Dr. Moreau. Basically, almost all of the major tropes of 20th century science fiction into the 21st century, he created. The alien invasion story, the time machine story. Before he came up with the time machine, time travel was, someone would get bonked on the head and suddenly they're in medieval times, like in a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. He came up with the idea of a machine that would travel through time. So this is a photo of him when he was young, and looks like he could be the time traveler. Later he got kind of portly, but this is him looking his best. Very handsome young man. And this is a letter he wrote, and he has some of the most illegible handwriting of anyone ever. So he wrote this wonderful note, which I acquired, and I framed these two items together. So isn't that cool? So, but God knows what that note says. I'll tell you. So now we come down to this, and this is a photo of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle with his family. There they are, waving, and he went on a cruise with his family and in the 1920s. And this is a little poem he wrote while on board the boat. And it basically, talks about them being in the middle of the Atlantic, and it's a little piece of doggerel he wrote. But of course, Conan Doyle was the great writer, creator of Sherlock Holmes, and also wrote another one of my favorite novels, The Lost World, which is the great dinosaurs on a plateau in modern times have survived, and our heroes get to encounter them. If you've never read that, seek it out. It is well worth your trouble. Now we go down here, and let me again move the lights so you can see what I'm showing you. Yeah. Now this, let's see if I can get a better angle on it. Yeah, there we go. One of my dear friends was Ron Cobb, who was the great designer of Alien and Aliens and Close Encounters, and just on and on and on. He designed the DeLorean time machine in Back to the Future, one of the great designers of science fiction cinema of the late 20th century. And I met him when I was 16. When I was 16, he took me back to his place, and he had just done the 10 concept paintings that would sometime later sell Alien. Dan O'Bannon hired him for $1,000 to do 10 concept paintings. They were these most beautiful oil paintings. He was a phenomenal artist. And I'd always wanted to have an original of his work, and this is an unfinished painting. You can see the middle part he hasn't completed, but the two figures in the foreground, sort of like a mutant or an alien and a human being. This is sort of like after the bomb or the apocalypse or something. Clearly he intended this. In his younger years, he wanted to do magazine covers, like science fiction magazine covers, and clearly this was intended to be a sample that he could use to get assignments. Now, he ultimately did covers, beautiful covers, for Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine, and then went on to become a designer in film in the 70s into the 80s. And he was a dear man and a dear friend. He was also a political cartoonist. He designed some of the aliens in Star Wars, incredibly influential in science fiction film, and a great spirit, a great man. I actually did a portrait of him that I'm also very fond of that I'll share with you at some other point. But I recently bought this. It was on eBay. And if you search for stuff on eBay, you find things that nobody knows, because they recently came out with a wonderful coffee table book of his work and his life. And this is not in that book, because I don't think anybody knew of its existence, but it is definitely by Ron Cobb, and it is definitely a gorgeous piece of work. And then we move down here, and this is just a painting that Elaine and I saw that we liked. It was a house at night, a little at the Beverly Hills Art Fair, and we found it, and it's just kind of very evocative and calming. And so now we go up here, and up there is a photo of Hal Holbrook as Mark Twain, signed to me. I saw him perform Mark Twain Tonight 3 times over about a 30-year period, and he was always terrific. If you've never heard Hal Holbrook do Mark Twain, you can go onto YouTube, search out Hal Holbrook, Mark Twain, and you will be well rewarded. He is the great Twain impersonator, and he also was an actor in his own right. You've seen him in many TV shows and movies, but this is a photo of him from when he started doing Mark Twain in the 50s, or maybe around 1960, and so I went backstage. Each time I saw him do Mark Twain, I went backstage and met him and talked to him, and he was very gracious. And back then, when he was doing Mark Twain on stage, he would apply his own makeup. And here's a young man looking like an old man. Ultimately, he lived longer than Mark Twain, so he was an old man playing an old man, and all he had to do was put on the mustache and the nose, and and he was good to go, essentially. But I love that photo. And then now we go down to here. Now, you may wonder who on earth that's a photo of. It's such a strange photograph. And this is Truman Capote in a very famous photo by Richard Avedon. And Capote is sort of portraying like a kabuki kind of figure. And I love that photo. And this is a signature of Truman Capote's. And Capote was a troubled individual, but a great writer. And he was a friend of Harper Lee when they were kids and when they were adults. And he wrote In Cold Blood, which was one of the great nonfiction crime books of all time. And he also wrote A Christmas Memory, which is my favorite Christmas story ever written. And then we come down to this, which is, that again is Frederick Douglass in a colorized photo that's well colorized, very well colorized. And then this is a signature, an original signature of Frederick Douglass. And it says, it's hard to read here because of the plastic, but it says, very truly yours, Frederick Douglass, 1873, I believe. So it's after the war. So he's a middle-aged man here, but he was always very striking and a brilliant writer. And so again, if you've never heard any of his writings performed or read any of his work, seek it out. It's well worth it. And he was just a brilliant man. Then we go down here, And this, now first of all, here's my Star Trek phaser rifle replica, which I love. I love, I love, I love. But this is a wonderful craftsman painting that Elaine and I found up along Pacific Coast Highway. And it's in a craftsman style frame, a period frame. It's a recent painting, but we just loved it. And I know Elaine's taste very well, and so when I find something like this, I just say, okay, this is hers. This she deserves this, and we bought it. Now we go up here to another painting that Elaine loved. There was a fellow in Morro Bay, which is a little beachside community that we go to fairly often, and he did this phenomenal painting of Janis Joplin. Now Elaine is not she's a fan of Janis Joplin's music, but certainly not, into any cult or anything. But this was such a wonderful, expressive painting of putting your heart and soul into your art, really not holding anything back. That Elaine fell in love with it, and we bought it. And it's I think it's a very, very powerful painting, really wonderfully done. Now we go down to this. Now what this is, I'll get the angle on it. That's John Huston. So one day when I was a student at UCLA. They said, we're not going to give the lecture we were planning. We have a special guest. They wheeled in John Huston. He is the great director of Maltese Falcon and The African Queen and The Man Who Would Be King. Many, many, many other brilliant, brilliant films. One of the great directors of all time. And he was amazing to meet and amazing to hear speak. And that's a photo taken on the day that he spoke at UCLA. And then years later, I went to Key Largo. He also directed that movie. And they had the boat that was used in the movie The African Queen. And so this is me. With the African Queen in the background, the boat. And here's the little ad for it on the billboard. And here's another photo of the African Queen, the boat that was used in the movie. And then here's Happy Holidays, John Huston, signed by Huston. And then when we were in Key Largo, I actually took the TV set out on the landing, and we watched the movie Key Largo with the real palm trees blowing in the background in the night. So it was perfect. A perfect moment. And then finally, on my wall, this is a photo of me with my dear, dear friend, Ray Bradbury. I took that photo, and it really shows the affection and friendship that we had. And then Ray signed it, Mark, Mad Love, Ray B. And I knew Ray for over 10 years. I'd go over to his house once a month, and we'd just sit and talk about life and art and business and everything and anything. And he was just one of the great, great, great writers. He was the first writer I ever saw in person when I was 7. And I knew him until the end of his life. And God, every minute I spent with him was an education, a dream come true. He was just a great person, a great writer. If you've never read Fahrenheit 451 or The Martian Chronicles, I urge you to do so. And again, but this is my wall of all the friends and memories and things that have inspired and uplifted me. And I thought you might enjoy sharing it with me. So I hope you've been entertained. I hope you have been amazed and astounded. Don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Sci-Fi, push the button, comment, do all those things, tell your friends, and especially go to the Kickstarter campaign below and pledge whatever you can. Spread the word on that, because that's what allows us to keep filming. We've finished the first half of season 1 of Space Command in terms of principal photography, and now we're moving into the second half, the final 6 hours of season 1. It's an amazing story. I promise you will be blown away by it, and we really appreciate all of your help. So talk to you next time, guys, and thanks again for sharing my wall with me.